Well, good afternoon. My name is Anthony Bradley, and I am a professor at the King's College in New York City. I'm also a research fellow at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this next after lunch, full of energy session. I just commented to Jason that you can tell that people are having a good time because the energy level just continues to escalate. And it is such a joy to see such a fascinating exchange of ideas and to see relationships renewed and some that will be inaugurated this weekend. This panel is titled Race and Culture, How Skills, Values, and Attitudes Affect Upward Mobility. One of the aspects of Glenn's opening remarks is that the issues of culture and values and norms are contentious. And these are the sorts of issues we do not want to talk about. But these are the ones that we must talk about because there are no monocausal variables that got us here. It's a multivariate reality. And one of those variables are cultural values and norms. And Thomas Sowell has done such a great job of bringing those to our attention. And so we're going to have a discussion about those things. The way this panel will run, I have a set of standard questions for the panelists, and I've asked them to speak from their own expertise regarding some of the norms and values that can actually undermine and sabotage social and economic mobility in some of our communities. On this panel is Craig Frisby, Professor Emeritus, recently retired, which is that glow that you see there on his face. From the School of Psychology at the University of Missouri, Frisby has throughout his career studied psychoeducational testing and assessment, the education of ethnic and racial minorities, development of academic skills, charter schools, psychology of individual differences, and so on. Our next panelist is Bradford Wilcox, who is the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. Also a professor there in the School of Sociology, a visiting scholar at AEI, a senior fellow for the Institute of Family Studies. Professor Wilcox's research is focused on marriage, fatherhood, and cohabitation, especially on the ways in which family structure, civil society, and cultural influence the quality and stability of family life in the U.S. and around the world. Lastly, here is Mr. Robert Doar, the president of AEI. And throughout his career, he has focused primarily on issues regarding welfare reform and issues regarding welfare, particularly in the Northeast and in the New York City area. He's very familiar to all of us here, edited and co-authored and authored several books as well. So join me in welcoming our panel this afternoon. So I'd like to begin with this question because, as I mentioned, the issue of values and cultural norms and cultural practices it's contentious. We don't want to talk about those things, and I'm wondering if you could pan out a bit. And from your perspective, from your own discipline, why do you think that progressives in particular are reluctant to talk about the role of cultural values, cultural norms, cultural practices as the types of things that can undermine and sabotage social and economic mobility, particularly in disadvantaged communities? Feel free, anyone can start. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and start. One of the first things I just want to say before I dive into that, the answer to that question, is that I am just so pleased to see that this forum has broadened its scope in terms of the kinds of disciplines that the speakers represent. When I looked at the 1980, the first Fairmont Conference, I sensed that there was a lot of economists, a lot of political scientists, and maybe a few others, but I didn't see other disciplines represented. And so when they invited me to be a part of this panel, I was surprised and pleased that they invited someone that represents psychology as it marries with education. So emboldened by that, there are some things that I'd like to discuss that are unusual, that maybe you haven't discussed before. A lot of these things will be controversial, but my understanding is that that is what this forum is about. I want to just start off by saying I've listened very closely to all of the speakers today and yesterday, and I sense that there's a tension between certain principles coming from my perspective as a psychologist. And I'd just like to articulate what those principles are, and then I'll stop, let the others talk, but just to remind the audience that I'm going to be returning to these principles as I make comments. And that is you know, psychologists study human behavior, you know, how people think, how people feel, what their attitudes are and what their emotions are. And when we think about differences and similarities among people, there are three self-evident truths that are just self-evident. And those truths are, number one, there are universals, meaning that there are characteristics that we all have that we share in common with every other human being. So to be concrete about this, I don't even have to know you, but I know that you have to sleep, you have to eat, and you have to go to the bathroom. Why? Because we're all human beings. And related to that, there are universal principles that we are evaluated by that have similar consequences across all people. So at first, there are universals. Secondly, we have characteristics that we only share with certain subsets of other people. For example, I'm black. I share those characteristics with other blacks. I don't share those characteristics with non-blacks. I'm a male. I share certain characteristics with other males. I don't share those characteristics with females. I'm of a certain age. So whenever I talk to people that are of my age, we have things in common that I don't share with young people. And then, you know, you can extend that to religion, to where you grew up, to where you come from. So there are subsets of people that we share things in common with, but not with other people. And then finally, there's the principle of individual differences. All of us here are unique. And there are things that we don't share with any other human being on the face of the earth because we're unique. Even identical twins are not thoroughly identical in every way. If you get to know identical twins for a long period of time, you can tell them apart. So there are universals, things we share with every other human being. There are subgroup characteristics, things we only share with people who are like us in certain ways, and then there are individual differences. We're unique and we're different from any other individual. I sense a tension among those three principles with respect to a lot of the things that we've been trying to talk about. So I'll stop there, but I'll revisit those principles later on.
And would you say that progressives really struggle with acknowledging some of those? And I mean, if we're struggling with it, would you say that, is that fair?
The short answer to that, and this is something that we've said constantly, they don't want to appear to be racist. And a lot of times when we bring up these issues, they will run from these issues because they don't want to be considered insensitive or racist. So
that's great. Next.
So I think on that note, I'll just kind of carry the baton here. And I think obviously when it comes to my own area of interest, the family and marriage, there's obviously a kind of recognition that Daniel Patrick Moynihan's infamous report kind of raised the sort of racial issue around family, which made a lot of folks more reluctant to address it head on. I think that's part of why, on the cultural front, there's a lot of reluctance to address family issues in our public conversation. I think a second point, obviously, is that we are a very individualistic and freedom-loving country, and there are ways in which, even in this room, that we can appreciate, those dimensions of our life together. But when it comes to the sort of cultural traditions that would inform our lives together, including ones related to marriage, for instance, that impulse to kind of embrace individuality and freedom can be in tension with a more familistic orientation. I think that's also why we can have trouble around some of these cultural issues. And then I think the third point I would make is the way in which, obviously, since the 70s, there's been a kind of polarization in American life that's linked to how the two parties are addressing culture-related issues. And so that makes, I think a lot of progressives and Democrats instinctively, reluctant to address some of these cultural issues head on, or to just take this simply non-Republican position as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So first of all, I want to say that I'm not Kay Himowitz, who I was originally planned to be on this panel, and I miss Kay, and for all those who don't know her writing for the Manhattan Institute and others, she's wonderful, and we miss her today. The second thing is I had sort of a second confession, and I don't want this to sound like I'm exhibiting white guilt or anything, but my career is as a social services worker. I am a recovering bureaucrat. I spent most of my career as a government official in the body of the beast, providing assistance or aid to people in need in New York City and New York State. And I saw a lot there that had to do with cultural messages that were harmful. And one thing I want to make clear about those harmful messages about work or about family or about responsibility or about substance abuse was that they were corrupting the lives of everybody, not just Black Americans. But this is a serious issue for white Americans. There are more white children born to non-married women in the United States every year than Black children. So I think we need to acknowledge that the pathologies or the difficulties or the issues that we're talking about are prevalent in our society broadly and not are limited to one group. And I saw that in the social services welfare offices. And the last thing I'll just say about that is that I don't know why it is. I want to think a little bit about why, but it is there in so many ways. The messages of the government agency, and I'm sorry to say this, but for a lot of poor Americans, their relationship with the government agency is their most significant relationship with an institution. They're not, I'm sorry to say, in churches. They're not in other community groups. They have a card. They have a food stamp card and a Medicaid card. They know their government. And the government messages that we are still, unfortunately, putting forward are anti-work. They're anti-two parents. They don't care about the father. They ignore and are willing to look the other way when it comes to substance abuse and behaviors that are harmful. And what I did and what Eloise Anderson did and many others have done is try to acknowledge that government plays a role in people's lives, and at least it should make the messages clear about these cultural issues and not be afraid to use the bully pulpit, the signs in the waiting room, and the way in which we incentivize behavior to promote better cultural behavior. And I think there's a story in welfare reform of it being successful, but unfortunately it is a small story against a sea of messages that come from our public assistance providing entities that don't promote cultural behavior that would be helpful to themselves and their families.
Let me just say with you for just a moment here on this question. So in your work in New York City and in New York State, this is where the controversy, this is where everything blows up. I mean, what actually are those cultural practices and norms and values that undermine social and economic mobility? I mean, what were some of the ones that you noticed in the city and in the state that were actually keeping communities stuck in these cycles of pathologies?
Well, one of the most clear ones was when we started in New York, the centers that provided aid were called income maintenance centers. And the message was that we're responsible for you. and we're responsible for your income, and that we're going to guarantee you are going to be a ward of the state, and that's how you should see yourself. When we got some effort to reform, we turned the name of the offices into job centers. And so there are all kinds of ways. Another way is, how do you react to a family that comes before you of, a single mom, and where's the parent of the children who's not present? Where's the father? And the cultural expectation or norm that I think comes from public assistants generally is they're not important. They're not relevant. There might be some, but it's really, we don't have to worry about that. Now, if you have an office that says, no, this is something we're going to raise with you and we're going to discuss, and we want to talk about how we can get the father engaged in your children's lives and how they can make a contribution to your financial well-being, because people should be, in some respect, expected to make some effort to help themselves before the government rushes in. So those are two areas where it's just very clear. And of course, you started the question by, what is it about the progressives? And I was just trying to organize our offices in a way that I thought would help people. But I guess I would say it is that they want people to be wards of the state. They want government to be responsible for people's lives, and they reject the language of responsibility and the language of personal agency, and they accept the language of victimhood. And it is all to expand their power and their scope. And from my viewpoint, it's good for them, but not good for the people they're trying to help.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And so I'm wondering, how should we talk about, or rather identify what some of those cultural norms and practices are that sabotage mobility, because they're not black, right? So many of the norms and values that we saw undermine communities from the late 60s through the mid to late 80s, those weren't black issues necessarily, because we saw the same sort of things in low-income white communities as well. We racialized those, but they weren't black, right? So prior to the civil rights movement passage, those sorts of norms did not exist. But there was a switch. What are some of those from sociology, from psychology? What are some of those norms and practices and values that actually undermine that mobility that sort of creeped in the late 60s through the 70s?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily coming from psychology in answering your question. In fact, when you sent to us some examples of the questions that you were going to ask, I was struggling there, because the first thing that came to my mind was the Bible. And I said, well, this is kind of a secular situation here. Should I mention that? Will people think that I'm judgmental? And I'm sure many of you have struggled with that, because you imagine yourself standing before an audience and actually saying, this is right and this is wrong. And what kind of reaction will you get? And this leads into your question about progressives, because progressives, in my experience, they hate talk about universal values. The reason why they hate that is because universal values imply that there's one standard from which everyone can be evaluated, and that you might find that one group doesn't do as well as another group on those standards. I mean, that's the natural implication there. So I'm going to step out on a limb and explore this a little bit, then I'll shut up, okay? The Bible is a unique document, because it's the best-selling book of all time, and it will continue to be the best-selling book of all time. The Bible is a book that speaks to the individual heart, as well as being universal in scope in terms of its application. The Bible is the only book that talks about, it assumes right off the bat that there's a God and that he's active in the affairs of human beings, and it tells you what he thinks. Okay, so now I know as soon as I say that, some of you don't accept that, and that's fine. Some of you do accept that. But starting with the premise that this is a book that is unique, the Bible is a book, again, that speaks to the individual, everyone's individual reaction to this person called Jesus Christ. But it also has a lot of material about how God deals with groups and what he expects from groups. And so most notably in the Old Testament, the Bible tells a story about God selecting the Jewish people as his mouthpiece for his ways. And then in the New Testament, that moves to the church. So there's a lot that the Bible says about, God basically saying to a group of people, whether it's the Jewish people or the church, these are my standards, these are my characteristics. And if you follow these general characteristics, now we know within every group of people, not every individual is going to follow that, but generally, if you're a group that lives consistently with my moral laws, things will generally go well for you. And if you don't, things will not go well for you, okay? So I'm going to throw out 4 observations. I'm not going to answer them, but I would like you to think about this. The 10 Commandments, okay? The sixth commandment says, thou shalt not kill. Now, I look at secular literature, survey literature, which group of people in the United States are number 1 in crime? Murder, okay? The 8th commandment is thou shalt not steal. Okay, what group of people in the United States tend to be number 1 in these kinds of crimes? The next commandment says, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. What group of people tend to accuse everyone else for their misfortunes of racism? I fail, you're racist. You do this, you're racist. You're racist, you're racist, you're racist. What group of people does that? The 10th commandment is thou shalt not covet. The CRT movement is based upon a foundation of envy. It encourages black kids to envy white and whiteness. Envy basically says, you have something that I should have. I envy that, therefore I'm going to make your life miserable. And we see the proliferation of studies in college campuses of whiteness studies, white privilege, white this, white that. Whites have torn up everything. And it all comes from one emotion, envy. So ask yourself, if you're a people that lives life guided by these principles, are things going to go well for you generally? Okay, it's kind of a rhetorical question. Are things really going to go well? And so wouldn't it make sense for us, not only in this room and elsewhere, if we stand up and say, these kinds of behaviors are wrong, they need to change? Okay? I'll stop there.
Okay, very good. There you go. Yeah.
I guess in terms of thinking about sort of how things have changed, obviously, and this is a kind of a topic that's covered at length by Charles Murray in Coming Apart, there has been a series of normative shifts across the country when it comes to sort of the importance of work, when it comes to the importance of putting marriage before the baby carriage, when it comes to the importance of embracing regular religious practice. So all these kinds of things have kind of played out across the country in ways that have pushed us in a more socially progressive direction. And I think as we look at sort of the implications, though, of this, what's happened is that in this new world where there are fewer guardrails for a whole bunch of different important social endeavors and social relationships, what we see, obviously, is that our elites tend to navigate this new reality pretty successfully, but that a lot of other ordinary Americans do not. So the sort of the abolition of regular religious practice, the abolition of sort of marriage as a core anchoring institution for family life, the abolition of the expectation that every, prime-age guy should be working full-time, the breakdown of these norms tends to have a disparately negative impact on poor and working-class communities. And we've been seeing that in a variety of ways in our conversation today.
And the way that you can bring the norms back or make some effort in the absence of other venues in government, at least with assistance, is a reciprocal relationship. We're going to provide aid, the government's decided, the taxpayers have decided, the voters have decided, we're going to have this safety net, but we're going to provide it with an understanding that you need to do something in return. And if you don't, your benefit is at risk. And the fact is that that's not actually that controversial, because we learned, not just in New York, but around the country, is when people get that message, they respond. They go to work in big numbers. Labor force participation increased from below 50% to over 70%. People made changes in their behavior because they got leadership from the entities providing aid that said the aid is contingent on your making an effort to move back toward the norms. Another one that I think, and we've lost ground on this recently, has to do with substance abuse. I mean, the rule was if you won't go, if you're got an issue and you won't go to counseling or make some effort to get treatment, your benefit is at risk. And we're going to reduce your benefit or take it away. And that's a way in which you can enforce cultural norms in a country where the media, Hollywood, other messages from other communities are not enforcing those. And so this is the vehicle you have. And I think it's an underappreciated one, because for conservatives, it makes us all nervous because it's government. And for liberals, they don't want to do it. But the fact of the matter is, as I've mentioned before, a lot of the people we're talking about, white and black, Hispanic, Asian, they are engaged with it already. I mean, the horse is out of the barn. They are in the government benefit programs in big numbers. So we ought to use them to enforce cultural norms, whether it's about parenting or substance abuse or employment. The other one I wanted to mention, because you can do this in offices, and anyone who's worked in social services office that brought welfare reform to them knows what I'm talking about. There can be messages, about the benefits of work, about how income rises with work, or messages about the time-limited nature of assistance. Assistance is intended to be temporary. You're not supposed to be on assistance forever. There can be messages about the benefits of two parents active and involved in children's lives. So you can do that. And you can also send messages about things like patriotism. I don't, when I was the commissioner in New York State, New York City, I felt that, it was a government office, and I believe in respect to our leaders, our office holders of both parties, and so I always wanted to make sure that there was a prominent place. President of the United States picture. In that time, it was President Obama, and the governor and the mayor. So there was a sense of leadership, that we're all in this, we're part of something bigger, and that the policies that we're following, are pushing, have a consensus behind them about the importance of work and family and temperance. And so I just think that there's an opportunity that we are, in the time since the change in the political atmosphere, we're losing, to use government as a way to promote and enforce these cultural norms that are. But the most important thing I want to say is if Eloise or I ran a welfare office that led to a lot of people turning to work instead of dependency, some of us might say, look how many people we got jobs. The person who gets the job is the person who gets the job. The government agency, they're there, but the focus should be on the potential of the individual to step up. And the fact is, when those messages are sent, people go to work and they change their behavior and they become stronger and their families are better. And I know you mentioned a lot about data. There is just an enormous amount of data about rising incomes from work, better outcomes for children in households where there is work, rising income from support from absent parents, and the better involvement from absent parents in children's lives lead to better outcome for kids. So all of these things, in addition to, promoting our values, I get that, or these values, they also led to better outcomes for poor families, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, all Americans.
Now, there's some that would argue, because the data bears this out, that for many in low-income communities, the sort of pro-social norms that lead to social and economic mobility were actually undermined by the government programs themselves. And between 1971 and 1974, the welfare rolls went up like 425%. And so, in terms of discussing this in the larger social fabric of this discourse, how would you explain to people some of the ways in which these well-intentioned programs that were launched in the late 60s, early 70s, actually created and introduced disincentives for pro-social norms, actually made some communities worse off? How have you seen that in some?
So I think certainly we've seen evidence in the literature on the way in which there are unintended consequences, for expanding the nature and scope of welfare in the 60s and 70s, and then since then as well. And even today, what we see is that oftentimes, particularly working class families with kids, will face a real penalty between about 10 and 30% of their income. So I was talking to a couple, for instance, a white couple in Virginia recently, and they've got two beautiful young daughters. He's working as an IT tech. His wife's his partner's a stay-at-home mother. And as I was talking to them, it came out that they weren't married. And I kind of was asking him about that. He said, well, we actually had sat down at the kitchen table and we kind of calculated how our Medicaid coverage for the mother of the kids and the two kids would have been affected by getting married. And they calculated they would have lost, coverage through Medicaid for her health care, and he didn't have a family plan at work. So this is just kind of one example of how there are these programs that unintentionally end up, penalizing, in this case, marriage or other kinds of virtues as well. So that's part of the story, was of course discussed on greater detail last night. But I think it's also sort of important to acknowledge that since the 60s and 70s, we've seen, a dramatic retreat from marriage across much of the population, for instance, and in ways that cannot be attributed just to the welfare state. So we have to think too about how changes in the economy, and also changes in our culture have ended up making, marriage and family life a less sort of compelling way of life, a less important way of life for many Americans. So the state is not the only actor in what's playing out right now in the culture.
And I just would reiterate, the state is a big player in it, and it can go either way. And you're absolutely right that there was a time when we made some reforms and we got it, I think, right. But the vast history of the use of the state in these communities is not positive, because it was afraid to inculcate and promote values about work. And it decided, partly because it's easier, it's a lot easier to just send somebody a check, saying, But the fact of the matter is so I think you're right. And while I'm talking about way it can be done properly, the fact is the history of it is it's mostly been done in a harmful way, in my judgment, because it's promoted dependency on government as opposed to independence for the family and the individual.
I'd like to also add something related to academic institutions. And this is something Professor Lowry mentioned in some of his talks earlier. And, we've all been talking about how black people have progressed over the decades and the centuries in terms of playing, an equal role in American life, and how we are perceived as a freed, contributing people. But there are things happening that are undermining that. And let me give just a few examples. Universities now are starting the trend of getting rid of their SAT requirements. They will say that, well, we want to look at more holistic assessment methods, blah, 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 blah. Just let them talk. And eventually they will say, blacks, because we need more blacks. So get rid of the SAT, get rid of the ACT, because we need more blacks. Go to schools. There's one school out in Oregon that had a graduation requirement that basically said in order to graduate from this high school, you have to show certain essential skills. They recently turned around and got rid of that. Their rationale for that was real flowery, but let them talk, and eventually they'll say, because of blacks. Many schools across the nation are getting rid of their advanced placement courses and honors courses because they say that it doesn't promote equity. There's too many black students that are not participating in those courses. So instead of upgrading the skills of black students, let's get rid of them. And parents are going nuts, again, because of blacks. So what we're seeing is the progressive story is, we are being more fair and inclusive by getting rid of these objective entrance requirements. But what most other people, black and white parents, are seeing is that the mere presence of black people are destroying these kinds of standards. And you want to tell me that that's progress? So these are some of the things that are encouraging an attitude, I fear, among black students that, well, we really don't have to meet standards because things will be given to us without our having to earn them. And to me, that's immoral.
And so those well-intentioned programs actually undermine, create this sort of disincentives. I remember seeing some footage in the late 1970s of a welfare, a social worker essentially explaining to this woman that she said, you don't actually need a man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You don't need a husband. You don't really need one. You have us. And there's footage of this. There's grainy footage from the 70s, but she's sort of explaining you don't sort of need that, and it creates disincentives for education, disincentives for family formation. In many cases, disincentives. Remember early on in the programs, if you saved money, they'd kick you off, mm-hmm. right? And so these are the sorts of habits and cultural norms and things like that contribute to people escaping poverty. And when government comes in as a way of saying, we're your friend to help you do this, and the very programs undermine that, it creates those sorts of tensions. Mm-hmm. And you're exactly right. In education, it's going to foster this sense of resentment, but also this sense of well, I don't have to do any work, right? Which undermines their education as well. So.
All of this has to do with messages. And that's one of the great things about this conference is we've gathered and assembled wonderful people, eloquent people, thoughtful people, and they're communicating messages that aren't heard about from our media and from our prevailing heights of our culture. And so I've been talking about how to operate a welfare office, but there's also the bully pulpit of leadership and media, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity to send these messages that send a different message about responsibility and opportunity and about our country that can get through to communities that have lost touch with those values. And I really feel like one of the great things about this conference, but it can't just stop here, it's got to keep going, that everything a leader does, whether it's changing the standards or communicating about the importance of marriage, is heard and listened to. And we just have to, this is why it's so inspiring, is we just have to keep having the courage to say these things in a way that's heard. Because, first of all, they will help the people we're trying to help, but more importantly, they're correct, and they're being overwhelmed by a different message. And so Ian always wants me to remind everybody about, we were big in public messaging in New York City, and we did a campaign on the success sequence. And we did a campaign on the importance of two parents in children's lives and proper decision making. And we got a lot of blowback. People said, well, what do you mean? You might be embarrassing. And so we went to the local low-income communities and talked to young people. And the messages were very strong. They had babies in them, and there were strong messages about responsibility. And we asked the young people from these communities, did you see those ads on the subways? And they said, oh, yes, we saw them. And apparently, people very rarely remember an ad, but they remembered these. So that was good for the advertising crew. And then we said, well, what did you think? And they said, well, they're true. That's correct. We know that. We know that well from our own communities and our own families. And so there wasn't this embarrassment or this blowback. There was an acknowledgement. And again, if you have the courage to say it, and to say it in communities where it's not being said, I think there's there'll be more positive reception of it than we realize. And that's what I want AEI and others in this world of sort of communicating to be part of in the coming years.
Just to kind of pick up on Robert's point, I think one of our challenges is that we are living in a world where our elites talk left and walk right. On a variety of fronts, from how they handle schooling to how they handle marriage and family life. But I think part of the challenge is how do we get our elites to publicly articulate the virtues and the values that they're following in their lives. We did a report with AEI recently, for instance, looking at kind of California trends. And what's striking was that there were like 3 neighborhoods in the center of Hollywood that had virtually no single parent families. And so these are kind of wealthy folks living in Hollywood, living the dream, living probably neo-traditional family lives, and yet they're probably involved with projects that are kind of conveying a very different message to the broader public. So I think one of the challenges going forward is how do we get our university presidents, our school superintendents, Hollywood showrunners, the whole 9 yards, New York Times writers, to actually articulate, the virtues they themselves have followed, virtues they themselves expect of their own children, for for the broader population, kind of recognizing that sort of culture is a structure as well. And if you want the best for ordinary Americans, working class and poor Americans, you'd again give them not just these economic structures that are supported, but also these cultural structures that will help support them in making better choices in life.
You have anything to add to that in terms of what we can do to better communicate these values and norms as positive?
I'd love to have an answer to that, but I don't. But there are complexities in this that I would just want us to appreciate and chew on. And these make me hang my head because I'm guilty of some of these things. Have any of you here ever watched those reality shows, Hip Hop, Atlanta Hip Hop, or The Basketball Wives of whatever? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And what throws a monkey wrench into this is that these are generally wealthy people. These are rappers that are making millions. These are hip hop artists, tattoo people, whatever. But I look at 5 minutes of that and I just want to throw up. I mean, their values are reprehensible to me, yet they are rich. So is this a black thing, or is it a class thing, or what? But these are values that I don't agree with. Now, at the same time, and I'll be honest with this, most people here are familiar with the comedians, Chris Rock, Steve Harvey, Bernie Mac, Ari Spears. These are popular entertainers, and each one of them have a routine. This is how white people do this, and this is how black people do this. Now I will laugh at that. I mean, it'll strike me as ha ha ha, and I will. But then I step back and think: is this something I should be laughing at, or is this something that we should work to change? But there's an element of truth there that I respond to. Now, if you gave me a microphone and said, what are the cultural differences between blacks and whites, I wouldn't know what to say, but I would laugh at these comedy routines because I see an element of truth. So that creates a tension in us as to, can I say this is good, bad, or is this something we should just accept? In the academic world, there's a lot of nonsense, and I'll kind of share a little bit what I see, particularly in psychology and multicultural education. Among black progressives, there's this idea that there's an African way of doing things, and there's a European way of doing things, and they have all of these compare and contrast, and it sounds scholarly, but it's nonsense. It's just nonsense. On the other side, on the white side, in gathering data for this, there are a lot of white advocacy sites who don't have black people's best interests in mind, but they will invite their readers to submit data on what they've experienced interacting with black people. And I'll read some of this stuff, and while one part of my brain says this is terrible, another part of my brain, and I'm kind of ashamed of, says I've witnessed this stuff. So there are white advocacy organizations that talk about this all of the time. If whites write about this, they will tend to write under a pseudonym. And so I can name you a lot of books, and one author, Paul Kersey, I think he's written a lot of books on black crime, black misbehavior in schools, but he has to write under a pseudonym because if people discovered who he really was, he would be harassed. But he writes this stuff, and he has data after data after data that journals will not publish because they're afraid of the backlash of we're identifying black suspects doing X, Y, and Z. But he'll write about it in detail, and I read this stuff, and I just have to say, well, that's there's truth here. So all of these things are happening, and then finally, there are academic studies that have actually construct a laboratory experiment, and then I'll have black kids and white kids, and they'll see differences. In one experiment, for example, the experimenter will call a black child in, and he'll have two candy bars. One's a short candy bar, the other is a long candy bar. And I'll ask the child, you can have this short candy bar now, or you could wait an hour and get the long candy bar. And he saw racial differences there. More of the white kids were willing to wait an hour to get the larger candy bar. A huge majority of the black kids wanted to take the short candy bar now. They weren't allowed to wait. So that's where you have a lot of this data. And again, the challenge for us is, do we agree that these differences are real? And if so, do we want to put a judgment on them? And if so, is our job to try to convince our brothers and sisters that this needs to change? And that's the challenge for us.
Great. And we'll take questions next, so feel free to.
I just wanted to jump in here a little bit. I think it's important to sort of to make 2 points in conversation with you. One, of course, in terms of talking about racial differences, that you mentioned the sort of 10 Commandments example. It's also important to acknowledge that actually African Americans do attend church, more than whites and Hispanics and Asians. So if you sort of take the importance of, giving God his due, that would be kind of run against, your point there. And in terms of the other points you're making, I think it's important just to acknowledge that when you look at a lot of these issues, class is a major vector here. And a lot of concerns we've been talking about over the course of the last 2 days are being manifested in important and powerful ways among working class and poor Americans who are white, for instance. So we can't kind of lose sight of that class dynamic in this conversation. And I guess also just mention too that when it comes to sort of looking at the intersection between race and family, what we see is that African Americans who are growing up in intact families, attend college and graduate from college more than whites growing up in single parent families, are less likely to be suspended in school than whites in single-parent families, are less likely to be poor than whites in single-parent families. So there's a way in which we can't lose sight of the fact that family structure is an important kind of variable in all of this, and that once you kind of address that family issue, a lot of these racial differences become, much more minimized. And so if we were living in a moment, like 1940, for instance, when there weren't big racial differences in American family life, a lot of the issues that now are, occupying our attention, and rightly so, might not be so, so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that I've done in terms of the messaging is to actually talk to people on the ground in the community, right? I think conservatives often live in the world of ideas, messaging, but we don't actually get involved and love people, touch them, hug them, talk to them. We need to do more of that. I had a kid in Harlem who's we were walking, and there was a young girl. She had a baby, and I said, "Hey, you want to get married first before you have a child?" And he said, "Is that a thing?" I was like, "Yes, that is a thing. Marriage, then child." He was like, "Oh, okay, right." And so I think that's part of it as well, is getting involved with people on the ground. Let's take a few questions. Yes, sir, here in the green shirt.
Just ask Robert, whose work in New York was unbelievable. I mean, I've toured the offices with him. They were amazing. And the staff loved him too. Great leader.
They don't at AI. I'm kidding.
But I'm wondering, in addition to the messaging, how many does it matter? Charles Murray made his name with Losing Ground by talking about the disincentives, the incentive to go on welfare, and compared that to the income you would earn working. How important is it to continue to tweak programs? Brad referred to what the economists call the notch effects of Medicaid in his example. In my own hobby horse, which is housing policy, the average tenure in New York City public housing, of which blacks are the largest group, 20 years.
Yeah.
There's no time limit on public housing.
Right.
Earned income tax credit. I know are there other tweaks like that in addition to the messaging, we really should be still looking at?
Well, yes, I think there are, but I always think that the number one prerogative has to be that work always has to be better than non-work. That's the key incentive, that their income level will be higher. And you can make that possible not only by pushing and encouraging people to get into employment through the way you run the program, but also by rewarding work and by having the wages be topped up by various forms of work supports, which could include housing. But you can't allow them to be available absent the work, in my opinion. That's the key thing. It's fair to say that you don't necessarily can escape from poverty by work alone for some families in some circumstances, but you can't escape poverty from assistance alone. It's the combination of both that can work. And the way to tweak them is to make sure that the incentive is always more work leads to greater income, not less income. So I would say that's one, and the other is to just constantly be saying that that's part of the game. We're not going to converse with you. We're not going to engage with you on your situation unless you're also willing to make an effort to get into the labor force.
So going to your point, and I've worked in local government for almost 15 years, and one of the observations I make is that the government is an unfaithful husband and an absent father because it just has too many households to support. But I have a question about, and I love the fact that Professor Frisby talked about morality.
Yeah.
I think we're losing the ability to talk about issues, big issues in moral terms. And I'll give a personal example. I don't do this often because I've talked to some people and let them know I work for local government in Washington, D.C., but that's not why I'm here, and I don't talk about it publicly because I'd like to keep my job. But I'm gonna do that here because we're all among family. Right now in D.C. and in a lot of other cities, they're dealing with gun violence. And their responses are based on the notion that, not that shooting a person is wrong, it's that if this person had all of their material needs met, they wouldn't shoot a person. And at the same time, me as a civil servant, I get a notice from DC, from HR saying, you must take our shot for this particular virus. If you don't, you'll get fired. So we give jobs to the shooters and we fire civil servants who don't take our shot. And I wonder if conservatives realize that the political response to COVID has given us an opportunity to speak in moral terms, because that's what's been done for the last 2 years. If you don't take this medicine, you're a bad person. You're going to kill your grandmother and you're going to kill your kids. But I think we should be able to say, you know what? If the left is going to moralize, which they do, white people, if you don't say Black Lives Matter, you're racist, you're a bad person. From every level of government, from every cultural institution, from every sports league. I'm wondering, do conservatives realize that we have this opportunity, and will we have the courage to take this opportunity without feeling like we're going to step on people's toes or offend people, because obviously the other side has no problem doing that to us?
Any response, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the case that, times are changing, and we're seeing, a new movement in the Republican Party that's willing to articulate issues in the way that you just did, and including down in Florida. So I think it's time for Republicans to be more forthright in articulating the importance of these values and not backing down because they're correct on these issues. And by not talking about these issues, we are keeping a whole class of people back from realizing their best lives and living the American dream as well.
Yeah, great. Yes, sir.
So I was glad you brought up the Ninth Commandment, but I want to broaden it. I'm firmly convinced that the whole country is drowning in a sea of lies, right, left, and center. And I'm also convicted that one of the problems is the people who are in the sane right and the people who are in the sane left refuse to stand up and call people out for lying if they happen to be on their side. And so I would like to hear if people agree with me that one of the things, whether you happen to be right of center or left of center here, one of the things that we could all do is to be more brave and stand up in public and say that the people that, belong to our party or our group are lying. Because I don't know if it's Facebook or social media or the decline of American society, but I think we're just drowning in it. Crazy, nutty stuff on campus, crazy, nutty stuff about conspiracy theories, and people don't seem to have the courage to talk about people in their own party or their own group and say, you're lying.
I'd like to address that on behalf of the Manhattan Institute, the Hoover Institution, and AEI. That's one of the benefits of organizations like that, is because we are removed from the partisan fray to a large extent. We provide our scholars independence and the resources to be independent and to be brave. And I think to a large extent, a really large extent, we have been a place of where truth exists and where a willingness to call out the people that are lying. And I don't disagree with you that there's a lot of misinformation in the public dialogue. But in all three of these institutions and in the people here, we have people that are willing to call them out. But I have to give that little advertisement for our think tanks, because if they weren't there, what would be there? Our universities are not stepping up. So I think that's a reason why Raihan and Condi and the people at AEI need to be looked to, and we need to play a bigger role and a more aggressive role in these discussions, because we have the freedom, and I think we have the credentials academically, and we should have the courage.
Any questions from over here? Yes, sir.
Perhaps a point of fact. A claim was made at the very beginning, I think by you, Craig, about at the very top level, that there being these absolutes that we all share in common, and at the lowest level, another absolute is that we're all very distinct. In the middle there, you suggested that there were these sort of subgroup similarities that were kind of undeniable. I'm pretty confident that there is no characteristic that is universal to all people, in terms of the way that we practice race anyways, of all people who are black, beyond the fact that they consider themselves black, that is exclusive to black people. And I do think that maintaining some precision when we're talking about race is incredibly important. I think that we often run into this problem where we presume the sort of value and the efficacy of race as a mechanism for evaluating things, when it perhaps isn't the best mechanism. The questions that you posited but didn't answer earlier were, when it comes to murderers, like what group has the sort of highest rate of murder? Well, that would be murderers. What group has the highest rate of theft? Well, that would be thieves. And to the extent that's true, I think that there is actually far more in common between murderers of any particular race amongst murderers than there are amongst people of these different racial groups. And to the extent all of these things are true, then it begins to beg a different set of questions than I think we've been wrestling with here. Whether or not people who are definitely concerned with addressing not disparities, but actual deficiencies in our culture, actual deprivation in people's lives, ought to be fundamentally concerned about addressing themselves to differences and disparities. And to the extent we shouldn't be, even if other people are, maybe there's an opportunity for us to shift the ground underneath everyone's feet and have a more sophisticated conversation about these issues.
Well, the way that I would answer you would actually agree with a lot of the things that you said. And let me take what I said before about...
Really quick, because we're out of time, so go ahead. Make it quick.
About subgroup differences. The point there was that all of us belong to a variety of subgroups at the same time. So as we travel through life circumstances, whatever that subgroup characteristic of me is, that will come out stronger in some situations, but in other situations, another subgroup characteristic will come out stronger. So like, for example, in this particular forum, obviously among the African Americans here, we're talking about black issues, and that comes out. But then if I was in another situation with gender issues, my maleness would come out, or my age characteristics would come out. So we all have different characteristics that come out at different times. We don't act on our blackness at every single situation we encounter, and that's what makes us complex. The other issue I wanted to say about murderers, you're absolutely right. Research on criminals, basically, by some of the best researchers, comes to the conclusion that among all groups, racial and ethnic, there is a specific group that have criminal thinking patterns, and it's not correlated with race. Criminals think a certain way, and you could find a criminal thinking pattern in this group, in this group, in this group. So you're absolutely right. There is a specific class of people called criminals. They are multicultural. What makes them different is that they have weird thinking patterns about how they prey on societies. And we can't conclude that because blacks may be poor or whatever, they would have more criminals. No, criminals think like criminals. They commit crimes because they like to commit crimes. And that's across every particular group. So we can't stereotype and say that only criminals are in this group, and if you're affluent or rich, you wouldn't have as much criminal. Criminals are among all type of racial and ethnic groups.
Join me in thanking the panel for this conversation. Thank you so much. Really good. Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah.